Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our channel, AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom. Today, we are embarking on a really deep dive into the remarkable work of Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. We're looking at his book, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence, specifically Volume 1, Sub-Volume 2, which focuses on the governance of Hazrat Abu Bakr As-Siddiq. And hey, before we really jump in, if you're getting value from this, please do subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. And of course, please share it with your friends. It helps a lot. Okay, so let's get into it. This period of history is just, well, it's monumental. And today we're trying to set aside the usual narratives, the biographies, the military histories.
Which are fascinating in their own right, of course.
Absolutely. But we're aiming for something a bit more structural. We want to look at the birth of constitutional governance under really the most extreme duress imaginable. Our mission today is to analyze cases 25 through 32 from the source material. We're examining the specific rule of law decisions, the judicial blueprints that really define the early caliphate.
And that's where the lasting legacy is.
Yeah.
We're focusing on the period known as the Apostasy Wars or Hurub al-Ridda. And to really grasp the depth of these legal decisions, you have to understand the scale of the crisis. I mean, this wasn't just a few skirmishes here and there.
No, this was a full-blown constitutional implosion.
It was. The entire newly formed state was facing near total dissolution right after the passing of the Prophet.
So the very survival of the state was on the line.
Completely. It was the moment of maximum political, military, and I'd say spiritual insecurity. So the critical question we're looking at today is how Hazrat Abu Bakr As-Siddiq, when we say Arya, we mean radiyallahu anhu, may God be pleased with him. How did he manage to maintain these, intricate principles of due process and judicial fairness when everything was falling apart?
Right, because in times of war or any national emergency, the standard response for any ruler, then or now, is to sideline the law.
Oh, absolutely. It's the first thing to go.
You hear arguments about efficiency, speed, military necessity, or just pure emotional vengeance. They all take precedence over the slow wheels of justice. It's the classic playbook for emergency powers. You suspend rights to ensure survival.
And this is exactly what makes Abu Bakr's leadership during the Ridda War so unique. That's why we frame it as, well, the beginning of a constitutional emergency regime. He just fundamentally rejected that whole idea, the notion that laws should be suspended because of war. Instead, he made the law the supreme tool for the war.
So he weaponized the law, in a sense.
In a way, yes. His governing principle was rigorous, it was unwavering, no punishment without due process, no victory without virtue.
Wow, that is a staggering commitment. It means that the military action, which was, absolutely necessary for the state's survival, it had to remain subservient to judicial constraint.
It did. It established the absolute supremacy of the law, the Sharia, in its earliest political application, even over the immediate operational needs of the military, even over that overwhelming desire for swift, decisive security. This moral resolution, this is the foundation for understanding cases 25 right through to 32.
Okay, so let's begin where the crisis began. Section 1 covers cases 25 through 28, all of which seem to deal with setting the legal parameters before any major military campaigns even got off the ground.
Exactly. And case 25 it's foundational. It's titled Law as the First Defense of Faith. Now, when the reports started flooding in tribes withdrawing allegiance, refusing to pay zakat, some following false prophets, the immediate reaction from many of the companions—
It must have been emotional. Anger, betrayal.
It was. The psychological pressure for immediate, overwhelming military retaliation was immense. It felt like a deep betrayal, and it demanded vengeance. The feeling was that waiting, investigating that, was a sign of weakness.
You can just imagine the scene in Medina, this call for overwhelming force to restore honor and security.
Precisely. But Abu Bakr, he resisted this emotional tide completely. He insisted, and this is the critical constitutional step on legal verification for sanctioning any military action.
Legal verification in the middle of a national collapse. What did that actually look like on the ground?
It meant that before any expedition was officially launched, the state required detailed reports. They needed credible witnesses, verifiable evidence that the tribe in question had committed a clear, demonstrable act of constitutional rebellion.
A break with the Medinan state.
A demonstrable break. It couldn't be based on rumor or hearsay.
But wait a minute. If the state is facing collapse and you need to mobilize everything instantly, isn't demanding legal reports and witnesses, isn't that an administrative nightmare? Doesn't that risk military defeat because of the delay?
It was a huge risk, a profound one, and it just shows the political courage involved. But the calculation was, I think, very clear. Acting on emotion or rumor might get you a quick localized victory, sure, but it would destroy the state's long-term legitimacy. Think about it. If the state started attacking based on hearsay, every neutral tribe, every hesitant group would immediately join the rebels out of pure fear.
So by insisting on this judicial threshold, this proof of a constitutional breach, he wasn't just asking, are we strong enough to win this fight? He was asking a much more fundamental question.
Yes. Do we have the legitimate right to act?
That's the profound lesson of Case 25.
It is. Law, specifically the requirement for verified evidence, is what defined the legitimacy of the entire military response. It established that the armed forces were not instruments of rage or vengeance. They were executors of a judicial decision.
So like a warrant.
It's exactly like a warrant.
Yeah.
This legal prerequisite transformed the Apostasy Wars from a punitive expedition into a legitimate, sanctioned enforcement action against constitutional breaches. It's really the historical precursor to the modern concept of civilian and judicial oversight of armed conflict.
That structural discipline is fascinating. And it sets the stage perfectly for Case 26, which is a principle that seems to challenge centuries of cultural practice, the prohibition of collective guilt.
Oh, this one. This decision cannot be overstated in its revolutionary impact.
Why is that?
Well, traditional Arabian tribal justice was built on the principle of collective responsibility, collective retribution. If a member of Tribe A harmed a member of Tribe B was perfectly justified in seeking revenge against any member of Tribe A.
It's a blood feud, basically.
Essentially, yes. It was the primary mechanism for maintaining power balance and enforcing loyalty. But in the context of the Ridda Wars, if Abu Bakr had followed that norm, the war would have immediately escalated into a total war of extermination against entire families, entire clans.
A spiral of violence you couldn't control?
You couldn't. So the decision was critical. He declared forcefully that guilt must be personal. He legally divorced the individual criminal or rebel act from the political identity of their tribe. The specific ruling, accountability rests upon the doer, not his kin, was a direct legal blow against that entire tribal custom.
So Islamic law was asserting its supremacy over cultural tradition.
It was. It holds that individual culpability is the only basis for punishment.
This must have created immense internal friction, though. I mean, how did the military commanders and administrators navigate the practical reality of this, distinguishing between a guilty individual and their kin, especially when the kin might have been sympathetic, even if they didn't physically fight?
It wasn't easy. It required sophisticated administrative tools, which speaks to how quickly they were institutionalizing these concepts. They had to rely heavily on local knowledge, on credible informants, and, as we'll discuss later, on the field judges.
And what was the practical benefit of taking on all that difficulty?
The political stabilization was almost immediate. By prosecuting only the documented ringleaders or the active combatants, the state avoided pushing these huge, neutral, or even coerced tribal majorities into the arms of the rebels. It made future reconciliation possible.
So it effectively weaponized due process against the rebellion. It made the state seem rational, not vengeful.
Perfectly put.
Yeah.
This insistence on individual justice, not tribal punishment, is foundational to modern criminal jurisprudence and due process across the world. It shifts the target from the collective political group to the specific criminal act.
It separates political loyalty from criminal acts.
Exactly. Loyalty can be restored. Criminality requires specific individual proof.
That complexity leads us right to Case 27, which feels like the acid test of impartiality. The state desperately needed powerful allies tribal chiefs who stayed loyal to fight the rebels. And when you're fighting for survival, making exceptions for your friends is, well, it's usually standard operating procedure.
It is. You trade favors for support.
Right. So did Abu Bakr ever compromise this legal principle for political necessity?
This is where his constitutional discipline, I think, shone brightest. He established a strict and absolute prohibition against special exemptions. Even for the most crucial military commanders or elite political figures, he understood that the moment you trade justice for convenience, the law loses its ultimate moral authority.
It just becomes another tool of power.
Just another tool, no longer sacred.
Do the sources record a specific challenge to this? Perhaps an ally demanding leniency for a relative or something like that?
They do confirm the tension. There was a notable instance concerning a very influential tribal chief. His loyalty was absolutely essential to the Caliph's efforts in a particularly hostile region. A close family member of this chief was caught red-handed, providing material aid to a rebel faction.
That's a huge political problem.
Enormous. The pressure to negotiate a quiet resolution, maybe a fine, a private exile, something to sweep it under the rug, was immense. They couldn't afford to alienate this key military asset.
So what did the Caliph do? How did he respond to that pressure?
His response was absolute. He insisted if he stands guilty, he will be judged like any other.
Wow.
This required the allied chief to submit his own relative to the Medinan judicial process, facing the exact same potential penalties as any common rebel. The chief was forced to accept that his powerful position gave his family zero immunity from the supreme law.
That's just extraordinary. I mean, he valued the integrity of the legal system more than the immediate military advantage he got from that alliance.
The lesson is indelible, isn't it? Law has to be impartial to remain sacred. War does not grant immunity, especially not to the politically well-connected. This decision is really the historical articulation of the principle of equal protection under the law, especially during a crisis.
And it established that a state of emergency might change the procedures, but it can never negate the fundamental principle.
Never. The principle that all citizens, regardless of their political utility, are subject to the same legal judgment.
So to wrap up this foundational section, we arrive at case 28, upholding the presumption of innocence. This feels like the most basic right, but also the one most easily compromised during times of paranoia and fear.
It is. In a world just ravaged by rumor, by fear, by unreliable intelligence, maintaining the presumption of innocence was a procedural lifeline. Abu Bakr mandated that the state could not take action against any individual or group without first establishing guilt.
So innocence was the legal default.
The legal default. And the state bore the full burden of overcoming that default with clear, undeniable evidence.
Practically speaking, how did they enforce that? Didn't commanders in the field just rely on their military intelligence? This village is hostile, we have to treat them as rebels?
And that's where the procedural discipline was so vital. The state actively had to engage in verification, even when the initial reports were incredibly alarming. We find records of multiple instances where large groups, even entire small tribes, were formally accused based on that kind of early military intelligence.
And then what happened?
The subsequent judicial inquiries, the legal process, found insufficient proof. The accusations were traced back to maybe a few isolated acts or just a misinterpretation of events.
And for those tribes that were acquitted, what was the outcome?
They were immediately restored to their full legal status. And this sent such a powerful message across the peninsula. The state was not a machine driven by paranoia or arbitrary power. It was driven by verifiable facts. This procedural requirement anchored the state's moral superiority.
It taught the population that trusting the state meant trusting its adherence to fact-based justice.
Exactly. So by establishing these four principles before the main conflict really began, legal verification, individual guilt, impartiality, and presumption of innocence, they ensured that the very act of fighting the war was a demonstration of legal constitutional integrity.
It was a war defined by law and not just by force.
That's the key.
Okay, so Section 1 dealt with what you could call the constitutional drafting the rules on paper. Section 2 gets into the implementation. How do you make sure those rules actually function when your armies are mobilized and marching hundreds of miles into hostile territory? Case 29 addresses this massive logistical and structural challenge.
This is the operationalization of the rule of law. And the challenge was simple but huge. Justice cannot be confined to the capital, to Medina. If justice stops at the city gates, then the military campaign becomes nothing more than an exercise in raw power.
So how did they solve that?
To solve this, Abu Bakr institutionalized the concept of the field judges.
Field judges. Tell us more about who these people were. Were they like military chaplains or just legal advisors to the commanders?
They were far more robust than advisors. They were appointed officials, legally qualified jurists, specifically tasked with administering justice on the move. They traveled with the mobile military columns.
And what was their jurisdiction?
Their jurisdiction extended to hearing civil complaints, mediating disputes in newly pacified areas, and most critically hearing accusations against the military personnel themselves.
So if a soldier seized property unlawfully from a local, or if there was some dispute between a citizen and a newly appointed official, they could immediately go to this field judge for a resolution right there in the field.
Exactly, right there. This eliminated the most common injustice of wartime. Justice delayed is justice denied. The physical presence of the field judge sent a clear signal that the state's victory did not suspend local legal rights.
That's a powerful message.
It is. Because if the population saw that military success meant a total halt to all legal recourse for them, they would never trust the new order. They would just see it as one form of oppression replacing another.
That seems incredibly risky, though, not just logistically but politically. A field judge's decision might directly contradict a military commander's immediate operational needs. Was there a tension there between the judge and the general?
Oh, the tension was absolutely inherent in the system. But it was designed to be resolved in favor of the law. The lesson driven home by Case 29 was that swift local justice was the key to reconciliation.
It reminds me of modern systems.
It's very analogous to modern systems like constitutional military courts or, humanitarian legal teams that are attached to forces in combat zones. Their primary role is to ensure that the state's armed forces operate strictly within established legal parameters.
Safeguarding civilian rights even while the fighting is ongoing.
Precisely. The very existence of these field judges, it seems to be the practical mechanism that enforced all those principles we just discussed in Section 1.
Impartiality, presumption of innocence.
It was the mechanism. And that leads us directly into Case 30, which dealt with maybe the most significant check on power during the war, the principle of evidence-based accountability. This drew a clear, firm line between the military command structure and the judicial authority.
Okay, but in active warfare, a commander's decision is usually absolute, right? Time is short. Discretion is often the basis for life and death decisions. How did Abu Bakr judicially restrict a military commander's power?
The restriction was structural. The power to order punishment, especially capital punishment, was reserved for the judicial authority, not the military commander.
So commanders could apprehend people, secure an area.
They could apprehend, secure, and report, but they could not unilaterally pronounce judgment based on their own assessment of military necessity. They were required to present clear, documented evidence to the judicial element attached to the campaign.
So the commander's report was essentially treated as an indictment, not a final verdict.
Precisely. The military report was subject to legal review and the evidentiary standards that were established by the Caliphate's central legal authority in Medina. This separation of powers was asserted even during the absolute peak of the crisis.
Is there a specific example that really illustrates the force of this policy? A moment when a powerful commander was actually checked by this legal requirement.
Yes. The sources recount a very high-stakes incident. A prominent military commander submitted a detailed report arguing for the immediate and severe punishment of certain individuals captured in a hostile area.
And his reasoning was purely military.
His claim was based on his military assessment of their danger and their complicity in the rebellion. But the Caliph's central administration, upon review, rejected the report.
They rejected a commander's report from the front line. Why?
The specific reason given was a failure to meet the required evidentiary standard. The report lacked sufficient credible witnesses, or what we today might call material corroboration, to substantiate the commander's claims of culpability.
So the administrative urgency of the situation did not override the fundamental standard of proof.
Not at all. That is utterly stunning when you think about it. The Caliph effectively told a general leading an army in the middle of a war, your military judgment is not enough, you must satisfy the judicial requirements.
It establishes the supremacy of law over even the most pressing military need.
It's the earliest clear articulation of the separation of powers in this context. It codified the relationship between the two arms of the state. The military provides the force necessary for security, but the judiciary determines the justice of the action.
And that lesson must have filtered down through the entire military structure.
It did. Administrative authority does not replace judicial procedure. The sword must serve the scales of justice. It can never command them. This procedural integrity ensured that even punitive military actions retained their legitimacy, and it set a benchmark for all future governance.
So we've seen the foundation of law in Section 1 and the mechanism of justice during the conflict in Section 2. Now, as the military campaign succeeded and the rebels were subdued, the focus had to shift. It's no longer about winning the war, it's about winning the peace.
That's right.
And this brings us to Case 31, which deals with that critical balance between strict legality and necessary mercy.
The constitutional system has to have the capacity for mercy. If it doesn't, it risks becoming purely punitive and tyrannical, and that makes reconciliation impossible. So Abu Bakr had to define the exact point where the severity of the law should be tempered by the capacity for forgiveness.
And this is in the highly charged context of apostasy and rebellion. How do you even draw that line? How do you forgive someone who has actively worked to destroy the very state you're building?
The state made a clear differentiation based on really three criteria: the degree of guilt, the person's intent, and the sincerity of their repentance. Orders were issued mandating leniency where guilt was minor or where it was traceable to ignorance or even coercion.
So they recognized that not everyone was a true believer in the rebellion.
Exactly. They recognized that the rank and file often just followed charismatic or powerful tribal leaders. They did it out of obligation or fear, not out of some deep theological conviction against the Medinan state.
So they were actively looking for mitigating circumstances.
They were. They sought to distinguish the calculated ringleaders, the ones who preached false prophecy or actively organized military resistance, from the thousands of followers who were simply caught in the political tide.
And what was the outcome for those who were shown mercy?
The historical example here is crucial for post-conflict governance. Those who genuinely repented weren't merely spared execution, they were actively pardoned and fully reinstated as citizens.
That's a constitutional act of restoration. It's not just an act of kindness. It restores their civic rights and reincorporates them into the social contract.
It does. And the motivation for this immediate restoration was twofold: moral and pragmatic. Morally, it aligned with the core Islamic tenets of forgiveness upon sincere repentance. But pragmatically, it allowed the state to reabsorb these massive populations rapidly.
Stabilizing the vast territories they had just conquered.
Yes, if the state had chosen perpetual punishment or creating a second-class citizenship for former rebels, they would have guaranteed future unrest, chronic insurgency.
So it shifts the goal from purely punitive justice, just punishing defiance, to restorative justice, which is aimed at rebuilding a unified, functioning society.
That's the critical balance, isn't it? Law without mercy becomes tyranny, but mercy without law just breeds chaos. This approach established clemency and rehabilitation as essential tools of constitutional justice. It showed that the ultimate goal of state action, even against rebels, was to secure order and citizenship, not just to exact revenge.
And that leads us finally to Case 32. This addresses what might be the highest hurdle of post-conflict governance. How do you convince a recently conquered population that your rule is just and not merely victorious? This is the public restoration of justice.
Military victory is only the first step. The second, and much more lasting step, is securing political trust. And Abu Bakr established a groundbreaking practice to achieve this, holding open gatherings following the pacification of a region.
Open gatherings. What were these exactly? Were they like celebratory events, parades?
Far from it. They were forums for accountability. Citizens, and crucially, this included those recently subdued or even those suspected of past rebellion, they were actively encouraged to attend and publicly raise grievances.
Grievances against whom?
Against any state action or decision made by military commanders or officials during the war.
Wait, that sounds like an extremely vulnerable position for the victorious state to put itself in. You're opening the door to public critique right after you've asserted military control. It seems totally counterintuitive to maintaining authority.
It was an incredible act of confidence and transparency, a proactive measure against the abuse of power. It was designed to root out injustice committed by the state's own agents during the chaos of the conflict.
So the process ensured that if a commander had unjustly seized property or unfairly punished someone or used excessive force,
the grievance could be brought forward publicly, adjudicated right there, and the wrong corrected immediately.
So the state was effectively performing a public audit of its own wartime conduct, with the recently defeated population acting as the auditors.
Precisely. The message was unmistakable. We did not fight this war to replace one form of tyranny with another. Our claim to authority rests on justice, and we are willing to submit our own actions to public scrutiny and correct any failures of that justice.
That level of transparency is rare even in modern constitutional democracies, let alone a nascent state emerging from a civil war.
It's extraordinary. And it serves as such a powerful historical connection to modern principles of public accountability, to things like truth and reconciliation commissions after major conflicts. That process of airing grievances and correcting institutional wrongs is essential for long-term national healing.
It cemented the caliphate's legitimacy. They proved that the fight was fundamentally for the rule of law, and they backed it up by correcting their own system in public.
Winning the political peace that military force alone could never, ever secure.
Right. So the discussion of these 8 cases, 25 through 32, it really reveals not just a sequence of wise decisions, but the rapid development of a cohesive legal doctrine under the most intense pressure. Let's try to synthesize these principles. What were the defining constitutional pillars that were established during the Ridda Wars?
When you look at them all together, you see a legal framework that was designed specifically to constrain the power of the state, even when that state was fighting for its very survival.
Okay, so let's start with the four foundational principles that were set before the armies even marched.
Right. First, we had Case 25, requiring legal proof before punishment. That made law the first defense. Then Case 26 established no collective guilt, which revolutionized social norms by demanding individual accountability.
Then impartiality.
Exactly. Case 27 ensured equality before law, demanding impartiality even from politically crucial allies. And then Case 28 guaranteed the presumption of innocence, forcing the state to shoulder the burden of proof.
Okay, then you have the two operational checks that were put in place during the active conflict.
Yes. Case 29 mandated judicial due process during war through the field judges, which prevented justice from just being suspended. And Case 30 established evidence over command, structurally separating military authority from legal judgment.
And finally, the principles that guided the long-term project of restoration and reconciliation.
That would be Case 31, which gave us the mandate for mercy balanced with justice, making sure the state differentiated between the ringleaders and the followers. And finally, Case 32, which ensured public transparency after conflict through those open gatherings, which rebuilt trust.
When you look at those 8 pillars developed in real time in the early 7th century, the evidence is it's overwhelming. This wasn't just pragmatic leadership. This was the creation of a profound legal architecture, an architecture that asserted the supremacy of law over power.
That is the ultimate conclusion, I think. Abu Bakr's caliphate, rather than falling back on martial law or, arbitrary fear-driven rule, which would have been completely understandable in the circumstances, it systematically used constitutional law, derived from the Quran and Sunnah, to manage the crisis. The law became the primary means of legitimizing state power.
And that brings us back to that designation you mentioned at the very beginning. Why is this period designated as something so unique in global history?
Because it fits the definition perfectly. We designate Abu Bakr's caliphate as the world's first constitutional emergency regime.
What does that mean exactly?
In so many historical and modern contexts, an emergency declaration serves as the legal justification for suspending constitutional rights and concentrating power in the executive. Here, the emergency of the Apostasy Wars did the exact opposite.
It strengthened the Constitution.
It forced the state to articulate and strengthen its constitutional principles more clearly than ever before. It enshrined justice, due process, and accountability as the indispensable core elements of state power, regardless of the external threat. The crisis, paradoxically, was used to reinforce the rule of law.
That is a phenomenal deep dive. It completely reframes the Ridda Wars from just a simple military challenge into a foundational constitutional moment.
It certainly redefined the limits of state power and judicial restraint in that part of the world, and it created a legacy that it echoes through legal systems globally even today.
So next time, we'll take these principles of justice and accountability and apply them to the broader question of national defense. In Episode 5, which covers cases 33 through 40, we'll explore the defense and national security doctrine.
How Abu Bakr used law to guide military strategy, developing a constitutional model of national defense rooted in justice, proportionality, and faith. It's a fascinating extension of everything we've talked about today.
It sounds like a perfect follow-up.
Before we wrap up, I just want to leave you with a reflection on why this historical moment remains so resonant, so important today.
Peace.
In his rule, the sword bowed to the law, and the law bowed only to God. Abu Bakr As-Siddiq proved, I think definitively, that justice is not something that is suspended in war. Rather, justice becomes most sacred, and indeed most essential, precisely when the world is burning.
A profound and necessary thought to carry forward. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into constitutional justice during crisis. We look forward to exploring the next set of foundational decisions with you next time.